A cop shot Ronda Rousey's dog right in front of her. He thought he could get away with it, but he bitterly regretted it. Subscribe and comment where you're watching this video from. The gravel crunched faintly beneath her shoes, rhythmic and even, matching the cadence of her breath and the whisper of wind through the eucalyptus trees lining the trail. The sun was still low in the sky, its light slanting golden and soft, stretching long shadows across the ground. Ronda Rousey moved like part of the landscape, her stride smooth and fluid, her breath controlled, her body familiar with every dip and turn of the winding path ahead. Just behind her, never more than 2 feet away, padded the solid, graceful form of her Belgian Malinois, Aries. He was lean, powerful, and precise in his movements, every muscle built for responsiveness. His dark fur rippled with motion, his ears slightly forward, tail held neutral, eyes alert but calm. He didn't pull or stray. He didn't sniff the grass like a curious house pet. He moved with her, as if tethered not by the leash in her hand, but by an unspoken pact forged through years of training, companionship, and shared silence. Their run was more than exercise. It was ceremony, a communion between warrior and guardian. Ronda had never needed peace more than she did now, and Aries was the last living thing that understood her without asking questions. He didn't care about her titles, the gold medals, the world championships, or the string of viral moments that had once made her a household name. He knew her routine, her voice, her quiet cues. That was enough. They returned the same way every morning, down through the dip near the dry creek bed, past the bench with the graffiti that had never been painted over, through the row of jacaranda trees whose blossoms painted the ground purple in spring. This was her sanctuary. Out here, no reporters, no flashing cameras, no trolls dissecting her words or her worth, just muscle, breath, sun, and dog. The house she lived in wasn't what people imagined. No fortress, no mansion, a modest single-story home with wide eaves, an overgrown vegetable garden, and a wraparound porch that creaked underfoot. It had been her grandmother's house once. Now it was hers, inherited after the old woman passed, and it still smelled faintly of lemon oil and books even after years of use. Inside, everything was in its place. Simple, purposeful. The heavy bag hung in the garage. The mat by the back window remained untouched except by bare feet. There were no awards on the walls, no photos of her with celebrities or politicians. Just Aries' leash hung neatly by the door, coiled like a promise. Ronda had learned the hard way that peace didn't come in applause or in medals. It came in structure, in silence, in routines that dulled the sharp edge of memory. The structure kept the chaos out. But even in the stillness, she felt the weight of eyes. Not always seen, but sensed. The neighbors in this gentrifying edge of Los Angeles nodded politely, but rarely stopped to chat. Some crossed the street when she passed, whether it was her build, the confident set of her shoulders, or the presence of a large dog at her side. She never knew for sure. Most simply called her the woman with the dog. She didn't mind. Better that than the other name she'd been given when she was famous. She sipped her coffee in the mornings on the porch, Aries lying at her feet, always watching. She didn't talk much to anyone anymore. She didn't feel the need. The world had taken enough of her voice. Let it learn to listen in the quiet. The first time she noticed the new patrol unit, it was early, barely past 6. A black and white cruiser parked idly at the far end of the park's loop trail, just before the concrete path curved into the denser trees. The officer didn't get out. Just sat there, engine humming, sunglasses hiding his eyes. At first, she paid him no mind. It wasn't illegal to park there. It wasn't unusual for police to patrol public trails, but the next day the car was there again. And again the next, always at the same time, always with the same idle watchfulness. Aries noticed, too. His ears twitched slightly when they passed, his gaze turning back toward the cruiser even after they moved past. Ronda said nothing, but she cataloged the details. The squad number, the lack of a partner, the way the driver's head followed her. By the fifth day, the car wasn't just parked. It pulled slowly around the bend just as she and Aries crossed the wooden bridge near the northern gate. The cruiser idled for a few seconds, then rolled ahead to meet them. The window slid down. "Morning," came the voice, neutral but clipped. A white man in his late 40s, square jaw, sun-leathered skin, buzzed hair under a patrol cap. His badge read Hartman. Ronda gave a brief nod and kept walking. "Morning." He didn't press, just watched her pass. She felt the weight of his gaze on her back long after he was out of sight. She didn't like it. That evening, she pulled up the home's camera system, checked her motion logs. No entries. She swept the perimeter anyway, Aries beside her, silent and patient as always. She trusted her instincts, and something in her gut told her this wasn't just coincidence. She'd been watched before. The press, obsessive fans, jealous competitors. This felt different. Not curious, not opportunistic, predatory. She didn't run the next morning. Instead, she trained at home, stretching longer than usual, working through shadowboxing drills that made Aries sit up and wag his tail. She took him to the far lot near the hardware store instead, where the trails were wider and less trafficked. The cruiser wasn't there. She tried to tell herself she was overreacting, but she didn't believe it. Days passed. The patrol car didn't reappear. Ronda resumed her usual route. Slowly, the edge dulled, but the memory of it didn't fade. She was always watching now, not afraid, just ready. Aries remained steady, her constant. When she dreamed of combat, it was often Aries' bark that woke her. When the storms rolled through, it was Aries' body at her feet that grounded her. When the world spun too fast, his stare brought her back. She didn't need anyone else. Then, one Tuesday, just as the sky began to lighten, and the dew still clung to the grass, she rounded the curve past the jacaranda trees and saw the cruiser again. This time it wasn't parked. It was creeping forward, slow, deliberate. Aries stopped. His tail didn't wag. His ears pricked forward. Hartman stepped out of the vehicle. No partner, no clipboard, just him. Hands on his belt, not resting, ready. Ronda felt her heart rate shift, not with fear but focus. She kept walking. The distance between them closed with each step. Hartman said nothing at first, just stood with his legs shoulder-width apart, body turned slightly, like someone preparing to box. When she reached conversational distance, he spoke. "You always walk that dog off leash?" Ronda raised an eyebrow. "He's leashed." Hartman's eyes flicked down. The tether was there, looped around her wrist, slack but present. He said, voice still casual. "You live around here?" "Yes." He tilted his head. "Just haven't seen you before." She didn't answer. Aries didn't move. Something shifted in Hartman's jaw, an almost imperceptible tightening, a flicker of something behind the eyes. Ronda stepped past him without breaking stride. "Have a good day, officer." Aries followed. Hartman didn't say another word, but she heard the click of his radio as she walked away. That night, she double-checked the locks, reviewed the footage again, slept with the leash on the table beside her bed. Aries lay at the foot of the mattress, chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, unaware of the weight in her chest. She watched him as the hours slipped past. The light from the hallway fell across his fur, casting the faintest glint against the tag on his collar. She reached down, fingers brushing against his neck, and whispered a word she hadn't said in months. "Stay." It wasn't a command. It was a prayer. And the next day, everything would shatter. The next morning unfolded like the others before it. Quiet, pale with dawn, the air still carrying the chill of night. Ronda rose before her alarm, though she hadn't really slept. Her body followed routine out of habit, not rest. She washed her face in the cold tap water, pulled her hair back in a tight ponytail, and dressed in the same black running tights and gray zip-up she wore every Tuesday. Her hands moved with mechanical purpose as she clipped the leash to Aries' collar and opened the front door. The scent of eucalyptus was stronger this morning, mixed with the earthy promise of oncoming heat. Aries padded forward ahead of her, tail low, his body a mirror of her focus. He paused at the gate like he always did, waiting for her to scan the street. Nothing unusual. The sun had not yet crested the hills. The road was empty. The silence was deep, almost unnatural. They started at a jog, feet striking pavement in sync. Ronda's body adjusted easily to the rhythm. 1-2, 1-2, 1-2. Aries matched her stride without strain. As they neared the trail, Ronda's eyes narrowed. The patrol car was already there. Hartman's cruiser was parked at an odd angle, not fully off the road. The driver's door was open, but the man himself was nowhere in sight. Her jaw tightened slightly. The logical part of her mind ran through scenarios. Maybe he was checking something. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe. She slowed, instinct overriding habit. Aries noticed the shift immediately and responded, stepping slightly in front of her without a sound. His body language was relaxed but alert. His ears twitched, his breathing steady. Then Hartman emerged from behind the thicket near the entrance to the trail. He wasn't holding anything. His hands were at his sides, fingers slightly curled, thumbs twitching like they were used to resting on a belt that wasn't there. He wore the same uniform, the same expressionless face, but there was something different this time. Not the casual stance of a man just doing his rounds. There was intention in his movements, precision, calculation. Ronda stopped. Aries halted beside her, head tilted slightly, sensing the shift in her energy. Hartman didn't greet her. He didn't offer any bureaucratic preamble. He just walked directly into her path, stopping a few feet ahead. "You again," he said, voice flat. She didn't answer. "I asked you before about that dog." "He's leashed," she replied, just as flat. "Not what I meant," he said, stepping closer. "He's military trained, right? A weapon?" "He's a service animal." "Same thing." "No," she said calmly, "it isn't." Hartman studied her, eyes narrowing behind the shadow of his cap. "You got a permit for that kind of training?" "There's no permit required for discipline." "You military?" "No." "But you move like you are." Ronda said nothing. Hartman took another step. "I asked for ID last time. You didn't show it." "You didn't ask. You tried to provoke." He laughed once, short and humorless. "Lady, you walk around here with that thing like you're patrolling Iraq. Maybe people feel unsafe. Then maybe those people should examine their fear." He didn't like that. She could see it. His face twitched just enough to betray the cracks beneath the surface. His right hand brushed his belt where his holster rested. Aries picked up on it, his ears flattening for a second before returning to neutral. He didn't bark. He didn't lunge. He simply shifted, stepping closer to Ronda, placing his body diagonally between them. That was all it took. Hartman's hand flew to his sidearm, and before Ronda could take a breath, the gun was raised. The shot came instantly, echoing through the quiet like a lightning crack. Ari stumbled. It was a strange movement, not a fall, but a sudden loss of symmetry, like one side of his body had given out beneath him. His legs buckled, and he dropped to the ground with a sound that Ronda would never forget. Not a bark, not a whimper, just the sickening thump of weight meeting dirt. The world went silent. Ronda's legs moved before her thoughts caught up. She dropped beside Ari's, her hands flying to his side, finding blood. So much blood. His eyes were wide and confused, darting to her face. His breathing was fast, then shallow, then ragged. She pressed her hands to his chest, feeling warmth and slipping fur, trying to apply pressure, though she knew it was useless. She looked up. Hartman was standing with the gun still raised, his mouth half open like he hadn't realized what he'd done until the noise stopped. "You shot him," she said, not loud but pointed. The words, like stones, dropped into a still pond. "He moved," Hartman said quickly. "He moved on me. He lunged. He didn't lunge. He was about to. You saw it. I saw you raise your weapon before he moved. He's trained to protect. That's threat behavior. He was doing his job," she said, rising slowly, her hands wet and trembling, not from fear but fury. "And you just killed him." Hartman adjusted his stance. "Stay where you are, ma'am." But she was already moving. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She didn't attack. She stepped toward him deliberately, her body calm, her voice low. "I am not your enemy," she said. He raised the weapon again. "I said, stay back." And then she moved. Later, witnesses would say it happened too fast to follow, that she covered the distance between them in less than a breath, that his arm was twisting before he realized she'd touched him, that the gun fell to the ground like a toy, and that his knees hit the dirt like he'd slipped on oil. Ronda didn't hurt him, not in the way she could have. She disarmed him. She neutralized the threat. She left him on his back, winded, unarmed, and stunned. Then she picked up Aries. He was still breathing, but barely. She didn't say a word as she cradled his body and walked back toward her house. She passed a group of onlookers, one of whom had recorded the entire incident on their phone. Another had called emergency services. One older man stepped aside with a quiet, "God bless you," but she didn't acknowledge it. By the time she reached her front gate, Aries was gone. The leash trailed limp from her wrist. She laid him on the porch and knelt beside him, brushing back the fur from his face, whispering words he couldn't hear. The world blurred, not from tears, but from the weight of loss settling behind her ribs. When the second police unit arrived, she was still sitting there, hands stained red, breathing slow and even. They approached cautiously, but she didn't move. "Don't touch him," she said quietly. They didn't. She was taken into custody, not in handcuffs, not with aggression, just processed, just filed, just paperwork. They called her a witness, not a suspect. Hartman was taken separately. She didn't speak during the ride, didn't answer questions, didn't react. At the station, she sat under fluorescent lights, the hum above her a constant drone. Her fingers were still sticky with Ari's blood. No one offered her water. No one offered an apology. She stared at the table in front of her and saw only the shape of him, curled, protective, watching her even in pain. She hadn't cried. She wouldn't. Not here. Later, when she was released, she walked home in silence. Reporters had begun to gather near the station, alerted by the onlookers' video that was already making the rounds on social media. She kept her head down. Back inside her home, everything was as it had been that morning. Shoes by the door, coffee cup in the sink, his food bowl on the mat. But Aries was gone. She stood in the center of the room and looked at the leash she still carried. It felt like a noose. Her knees buckled, and for the first time in years she let herself collapse. But she still didn't cry. She just sat on the cold floor, staring at the silence. And in the stillness of her grief, something began to take root. Not rage, resolve. The floor was cold beneath her skin, and still she didn't move. Ronda sat there long after the sun had crept through the slats of the blinds, painting soft yellow lines across the living room walls. Her hands rested loosely in her lap, stained a faint dried brown where Aries' blood had soaked in. The leash still dangled from her wrist, half coiled, its clip glinting dully in the morning light. Time had lost its shape. She hadn't showered, hadn't eaten. The silence inside the house pressed in on her like thick fog, not peaceful but suffocating. The kind of silence that follows trauma when even breath feels like a betrayal. When the phone rang for the first time, she let it buzz to nothing. The second and third followed shortly after, both from the same number. Mariana. Ronda didn't answer. She couldn't. Not because she didn't want to speak, but because there were no words to give voice to what had been torn away. She had known loss. She had stood on podiums and felt nothing. She had trained until her hands bled, fought until her body broke. But none of it compared to this. The sudden, brutal removal of something innocent, loyal, and constant. Aries had been her last connection to something good. The evening before replayed behind her eyes like a loop in film. The shot, the blood, the weight of his body as she carried him. Hartman's face, vacant but sure of his own righteousness. The station, where the officers spoke to her like she were a potential threat instead of a grieving woman. No one had said they were sorry. No one had even looked her in the eye. Outside, the world continued. On the news, the video had begun to circulate. A shaky cell phone recording captured the entire event. Hartman stepping forward, Ronda trying to disengage, Aries moving in calm response, and then the gunshot. The silence that followed was almost more damning than the sound itself. And then came the takedown. Swift, professional, restrained. Ronda disarming Hartman like it was training day at a combat facility, not a public park. Some news outlets had already seized on the story, painting it as a tragic misunderstanding. Others treated it like a scandal. MMA fighter takes down cop after dog is shot. Ronda didn't care about the headlines. She cared about the truth. And the truth was that her dog was dead, and the man who pulled the trigger was already being protected. By late afternoon, a police spokesperson had issued a formal statement. Officer Hartman discharged his weapon in response to what he perceived as an imminent threat posed by a large, aggressive canine. An investigation is underway. The phrasing was sterile, cold, and vague. They called Aries a large canine. They called his death an unfortunate incident. Ronda read the press release once, then closed the browser without a word. She finally rose from the floor when the sky outside had begun to deepen into dusk. She moved stiffly, every joint feeling rusted. She stripped off the clothes from that morning and dropped them into a bag she tied shut without looking. In the shower, the water ran red for a moment before turning clear. She stood under it long after the heat faded. When she emerged, she dressed in silence and stepped barefoot into the living room. Aries' bed was still there, in its usual corner by the bookshelf. His toy, a battered, knotted rope, lay where he had dropped it the day before. Ronda walked over slowly, dropped to her knees, and picked it up. It still smelled faintly of him. She pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes. That night, she opened a drawer in her office and pulled out a small hard drive. It was her archive, a digital collection of memories, footage, training sessions, GPS data, and documents. She plugged it in, opened the folder marked simply Aries, and began to watch. There were videos of him as a pup, chasing her shoelaces, falling asleep in her lap. Training sessions where he learned to track, respond to verbal cues, and move on silent commands. Footage from the one time she had considered training him for service certifications. He had passed with flawless marks. Her voice in the background of one clip said, "He's smarter than half the trainers I've worked with." It took hours, but she watched every file. When the last one ended, the screen faded to black. She sat back, her face unreadable. The next day, she received an official letter from the department. They were opening an internal review. Officer Hartman had been placed on administrative leave pending the results. No mention of suspension, no mention of criminal charges, just bureaucracy, just words. The letter felt like a slap. Mariana called again that afternoon. This time, Ronda answered. "They're burying it," Mariana said without preamble. "You know that, right?" "I know." They called the footage inconclusive, said it didn't show a clear threat, but it's public. Everyone's seen it. That doesn't matter. It should. There was a pause. Ronda didn't fill it. "You have a platform," Mariana continued. "You know that. People listen to you. If you go public..." "No. You could pressure the department. Speak out. Demand action." Ronda's voice was calm but final. "I'm not interested in speeches." Mariana exhaled, frustrated. "Then what are you going to do?" "I'm going to make sure they remember what they did." The call ended without a goodbye. That evening, she pulled a large corkboard from her closet and set it against the wall in her study. She began to pin up photos, maps, names, printed documents. Hartman's face, blown up from a still frame, a diagram of the trail, a copy of the official statement, the contact information for a local journalist she trusted. A flowchart began to take shape, webbing outward from a single photo of Aries. She wasn't angry, not in the way people expected. Her emotions were colder than that, sharper. She wasn't planning revenge. She was planning exposure. And exposure, she knew from experience, was far more dangerous to men like Hartman than any punch. Each night she added to the board. She tracked complaints previously filed against Hartman. She found two, one from a woman who claimed he'd used excessive force during a traffic stop, another from a teenager who said the officer had harassed him for filming a pedestrian search. Both cases had been dismissed. She dug deeper. The footage of the incident had now passed 1 million views. The public sentiment was shifting. Celebrities shared it. Veterans commented. Dog trainers and service animal advocates spoke up. A petition circulated. But still, the department said nothing. Ronda didn't speak to the press. When journalists showed up at her gate, she ignored them. Her silence made the story louder. Then came the threat. A letter, no return address, slipped through the mail slot. Inside, one sentence in block print. "Let it go, or we'll come for more than your dog." Ronda stared at it, then folded it and pinned it to the center of the board. That night, she sat on the porch with a mug of black tea and stared out at the dark. She didn't cry, but she felt the shift inside her, like a dam cracking. The grief was still there, but beneath it now lived something else. Purpose. In the distance, she heard the faint yelp of a dog from another yard. It was high-pitched and playful. For a moment, it sounded like Aries. Her chest clenched, then softened. She closed her eyes and whispered, not a name, but a promise. They would not forget, and neither would she. Children for raising her voice during a traffic stop. Her complaint was dismissed as emotional exaggeration. Another case, an elderly man, Vietnam vet, had been shoved against his porch after asking Hartman why the officers were searching his grandson. Ronda had recorded each conversation. She documented names, dates, emotional states. She didn't exploit them. She asked permission. Some of them cried. Others apologized to her for not fighting harder. That was the part that stuck with her. The apology. As if it had been their job to win. As if victims were expected to carry the burden of exposure alone. She created a digital folder backed up 3 times containing the testimonies. She included copies of the internal documents she'd acquired, news articles about Aries, reaction footage, screenshots of public support. The video of Hartman shooting Aries had now amassed nearly 5 million views. People had begun to remember his name, but the department remained silent. No charges, no accountability, just stalling. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her tea. Mariana, again. Ronda answered this time, not out of obligation, but strategy. "You're building something," Mariana said before Ronda could speak. "I can hear it in your voice." "I'm preparing," Ronda replied, not reacting. "What's your next move?" "Pressure, but not through interviews. You're going to release something. Soon. You should be careful. They'll come after you next. They already tried." Mariana hesitated, then said, "If you need legal protection, I can set it up." Ronda looked out the window, watching the light begin to touch the tops of the trees. "I don't want protection. I want witnesses." That afternoon, she sat in her study and began to assemble the video. She didn't want drama. She didn't want to add sad music or emotional narration. She wanted truth. She opened with a single image. Aries sitting beside her on the trail, tongue out, tail low, ears attentive. Just a dog, waiting. Then the footage. Raw, shaky camera, the moment Hartman drew his weapon. The sound of the shot, the fall, Ronda kneeling, the silence, her approach, the disarm, his fall, cut to black. Then the voices. Not hers, others. The woman on the curb recounting what it was like to watch her children scream. The vet describing the taste of blood after his head hit the concrete. The teenager shaking as he explained how Hartman forced him to unlock his phone without a warrant. The final clip, Ronda sitting alone at her kitchen table, the leash in her hand, collar resting beside her. No makeup, no script. She didn't speak. She just looked into the camera for 10 seconds, long enough for the viewer to feel it, long enough for the silence to hurt. She titled the video, "Something to Feel," and then she uploaded it. She didn't contact media outlets. She didn't post it to her own channels. She gave it to 3 people who cared. A trainer in Oregon, a Marine vet she once cornered with, and a survivor of police brutality who ran a nonprofit in Detroit. Within 6 hours, the video had reached every corner of the internet. Mariana called in disbelief. "What did you do?" "I told the truth." The backlash was immediate, not from the public, but from the system. Anonymous accounts tried to discredit the stories in the video, claims of doctored footage, accusations that Ronda had staged the takedown, that Aries was trained to attack, that her grief was performance. But it didn't stick, because people knew her. Not the celebrity version, not the headline maker or the WWE persona, but the fighter. The woman who got back up, the woman who didn't flinch. Other victims began to speak out. Quietly at first, then louder. A Facebook group formed, a subreddit. Then, a petition for Hartman's indictment reached 100,000 signatures in 48 hours. The department issued a second statement. They were reviewing procedures. Still no action. Ronda decided it was time. She left the gate unlocked. Hartman and another officer arrived at dusk. No lights, no warrant. They rang the bell once, then walked around back like they owned the place. She let them in without resistance. "Just checking in," Hartman said. "Thought we'd have a little talk, off the record." Ronda stood in the doorway, watching them take seats like they were in charge. "You've been busy," his partner said, gesturing toward the wall of evidence. Ronda didn't reply. Hartman leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You think this is going to change anything?" She still said nothing. "You keep pushing, people get hurt. That's how this works. And the public, they forget. They always forget." His partner added, "You're not the only one who can make people disappear." They laughed. She let them finish. What they didn't know, what they didn't bother to consider, was the placement of the hidden cameras in the vents, in the overhead fixtures, and the pen cup on the desk. When they left, satisfied they'd intimidated her, Ronda walked calmly to her study and reviewed the footage. Perfect audio. Clear video. Threats. Smirks. Arrogance. The next morning, she uploaded it, but this time not through intermediaries. She sent it directly to every journalist who had requested an interview, every editor, every legal analyst. She didn't speak over it. She didn't add commentary. Just a title. They always forget. It exploded. Within hours, the story changed. No longer about a grieving dog owner, no longer about a tragic accident. Now it was about cover-ups, abuse. A former combat sports icon catching two cops making threats on camera with the precision of a military operation. By nightfall, both officers were placed on indefinite suspension. The mayor held a press conference, forced and fumbling. "We take these allegations very seriously." Protests followed, not destructive, but unified. People showed up with photos of their own dogs, signs with Aries' name. Women wore T-shirts with Ronda's silent stare printed across the front. Mariana arrived that evening, unannounced. She stood on the porch with tears in her eyes. Ronda opened the door and let her in. "You could have done this with a speech," Mariana said. "I don't make speeches." "I know." They sat together in the study, the board still lit by the soft light of a desk lamp. The collar rested on the table between them. "You started something," Mariana said. "No," Ronda replied. "They did. But you finished it." Ronda shook her head slowly. "Not yet." She rose, walked to the window, and looked out over the darkened yard. The air was still, heavy with the weight of change. She felt it in her bones, not just the fallout, the beginning of something new. A leash still hung by the door, but beside it now there was another, a new one, clean, unused, waiting, not to replace, but to continue. The courthouse was colder than she expected, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. Modern, sterile, a cathedral of polished stone, steel accents, and artificial light that hummed overhead like an anxious breath. It had no soul. The benches were hard, the air faintly scented with disinfectant. People walked the halls without looking at one another, eyes fixed on clipboards, phones, or the floor. Justice didn't live here. It passed through in waves, diluted, delayed, distorted. Ronda sat near the front of the courtroom, her hands resting on her knees, her posture still, composed, unreadable. Her presence was not loud, not theatrical, but it carried weight. She wore a charcoal gray suit with no insignia, no statement, nothing to draw attention to herself except for the steady silence she emanated. Next to her sat Mariana, shuffling documents with mechanical precision, her jaw tight, her focus razor sharp. Across the room, seated behind the defense table, were Joe Hartman and his partner, both stripped of their uniforms, their weapons, their arrogance. They looked smaller out of uniform, not physically, but symbolically. The illusion of power had been peeled away layer by layer over the last few weeks. Hartman's face was paler than usual, his mouth a hard line, his shoulders rigid. His partner looked around the room constantly, as if expecting someone to shout or point. No one did. The courtroom was not full. A few rows of onlookers, mostly reporters, activists, and those who had followed the case since the first video. A quiet presence of solidarity rather than spectacle. No chanting, no cameras flashing, just the sound of justice moving at its glacial pace. When the judge entered, all rose. Ronda stood without hesitation, her eyes on the bench, her thoughts distant. She wasn't thinking about the outcome, not yet. She was thinking of Aries, of the way his tail thumped once against the porch whenever she opened the door, of the warmth of his body beside her feet when she wrote in the evening, of the way he had stepped in front of her without fear or hesitation that day in the park, trusting his instincts, trusting her. The judge read the charges aloud: unlawful use of force, civil rights violations, abuse of authority, falsification of reports. The list was not long, but it was pointed. Each count struck like a drumbeat. Hartman flinched when his name was read. So did his partner. Not because they were surprised, but because they were no longer sure of immunity. The trial was methodical. Testimonies were presented, videos played. Ronda didn't speak during the proceedings, not in person. Her voice had already been heard in every home in the country. Her silence now was its own form of testimony. She watched as the prosecution laid bare the department's pattern of cover-up, as the defense struggled to explain the threats caught on camera in her own home. When Mariana presented the footage, the courtroom didn't gasp. It didn't need to. The truth sat thick in the air, undeniable and permanent. When the trial adjourned for the day, Ronda stepped outside and let the sun touch her face. It was warm, almost too bright after the fluorescent glow of the courtroom. People gathered at the steps. Some tried to speak to her, to thank her. She nodded politely, but didn't stop. She wasn't there for gratitude. She was there because something inside her had refused to stay quiet. Back at home, the silence greeted her differently now. Not heavy, not hollow, just present. The leash still hung by the door, but the collar sat on the mantel now, resting beside a photo of Aries. She didn't look at it every day, but she felt it, like a heartbeat beneath the floor. Weeks passed. The trial continued, dragging its feet through motions and objections, but the foundation had been laid. Public attention did not waver. Every new testimony added weight to the verdict to come. The department tried to save face, tried to distance itself from Hartman, from the partner, from the past. But the movement had already begun to grow. Ronda didn't wait for the verdict to move forward. She had already started the paperwork, secured the land, and filed the permits. In a quiet corner just outside the city, construction began on a single-story facility. Clean lines, wide-open spaces, soundproof rooms for training, open fields for exercise. No signs, no slogans. Just a place built for purpose. The Shadow Program. It wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't even about healing, not in the traditional sense. It was about providing something she had once received without asking. Loyalty, protection, partnership. It was about building a future out of the bones of what had been lost. The center trained service dogs for veterans dealing with trauma, for survivors of abuse, for first responders trying to find their footing again. Not just any dogs, dogs with purpose, with instinct, with heart. Dogs who would stand in front of a bullet without knowing what a bullet was. Dogs like Aries. Word spread slowly. She didn't advertise. People came because they heard, because they knew, because they saw something in her they thought they had lost in themselves. Strength without noise, leadership without ego, grief without surrender. Mariana continued the legal work. Behind the scenes, she coordinated with activists, lawyers, journalists, building pressure to ensure the case didn't vanish like so many others. The judge moved cautiously but deliberately. When the verdict came, it arrived without ceremony. Both officers were found guilty, not on every count. Not to the fullest extent some had hoped, but the core remained. Guilty of unlawful use of force, guilty of falsifying reports, guilty of violating the public trust. They would serve time. It wasn't enough, but it was real. The day the verdict was announced, Ronda didn't speak. She stood outside the courthouse with Mariana, arms crossed, eyes forward. The crowd applauded, but she didn't lift her hands. Her work wasn't in the noise, it was in the stillness that followed. She returned to the center that night and walked the outer grounds as the sun began to set. The fields glowed gold, shadows long and soft. A new puppy trotted beside her, ears too big for its head, tail wagging clumsily. It wasn't a replacement. Nothing could replace Aries. But it was a continuation, a beginning. On the 1-year anniversary of Aries' death, Ronda held a quiet gathering at the facility. Not a memorial. A recognition. Families who had adopted service dogs through the program attended. Veterans stood in silence, some holding leashes, others standing with empty hands but full eyes. Mariana gave a short speech, precise, powerful. When Ronda stepped forward, she didn't bring notes. She held Aries' collar in her hands. "This isn't about revenge," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "It's about responsibility. It's about not letting someone tell you that you, or those you love, don't matter." Aries stood beside me every day without needing thanks or praise. He did his job. He gave me peace. He gave me protection. This, she held the collar higher, is for him, and for anyone who's ever been silenced, overlooked, or forgotten. You are not alone. The crowd didn't erupt in applause. They didn't need to. The hush that followed was louder than any cheer. As the sun dipped lower and the sky turned a dusky orange, Ronda walked the path behind the facility, the puppy bounding ahead of her, tripping over its own paws. She paused at the edge of the field, looked out at the world she was building, not a monument, but a movement, and allowed herself, finally, to breathe. Aries was gone. But she had not let him disappear. And in every step forward, in every soul protected, in every silent act of resistance, he walked with her still. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more powerful content. Watch the next video to see what happens when silence is broken. And don't forget to share this video. Someone out there needs to see it.